Welcome back. This is week 11, lecture 1, the post-war mess. Now, this is the last substantive lecture before your midterm 2. And the second lecture for this week will be simply talking about preparing for to write the midterm. Um, I don't think there will be a PowerPoint presentation like with the last one. It'll just be a lecture and it'll just be a talk going through the midterm with you. And we go from there. So this is the last substantive lecture until the midterm. We go from there. And it's, I think, appropriately titled, even if not very scholarly so, The Post-War Mess. Because in the previous lecture, we talked about World War II and the ending of World War II and the horrors that it caused and how to go forward after what had happened. And this is really the period after the war of trying to figure all that out. Now, the end of World War II often is seen as this period of then increased prosperity with the war spending. The recession or the depression, the Great Depression had basically come to an end. And it was an attempt to regain some sense of sensibility in life. And so it kind of after the World War II, we had the baby boomers, so to speak, generation. And actually, I think I'm at the very tail end of the baby boomers. And we have the 1950s, Leave It to Beaver, um, Fathers Know Best, and all these things. The image of the 1950s, though, is also very tense because it's also the age of the beatniks and rock and roll and Elvis Presley, and so there's tensions within society. It's not simply one uniform aspect, and there is tensions within the world. World War One, the Great War, was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and yet throughout the 20th century, Europe and the United States and the world has almost been in the consistent, constant series of war, or at least armed conflict. Why? I can't explain that. But we can look at some of the developments coming out of World War II. And I think I mentioned that the Yalta Conference and trying to decide between the big four, then with Potsdam, with Truman, Attlee, and Stalin, trying to divide up what was going to happen after the fighting all ceased. That's what we're going to look at in this lecture. How did that come about, and what were the results, and what happened thereafter, after World War II that was such a shock, and the Holocaust? What do we do about it all? So that is kind of why I say it's the post-war mess, because it was simply just a mess, even though there were attempts to try to prevent what had happened, what the world had just suffered and gone through. There were attempts to try to prevent that from ever happening again. And theoretically, we have not had another conflict that has been deemed World War III. It's always there as a threat. But conflicts we've had, wars we've had, even if not in a technical sense, World War II is still the last official declared war in the U.S. Depending on what we mean by war, but a formal declaration of war. World War II was it. And yet, the United States remained a war, still remains a war, in terms of military combat and fighting. What happened? How did it come about? Well, we first start then with the establishment of the UN. Because the UN was established after World War II as a means of fixing things, the means of establishing an international body to prevent future world wars, future armed conflicts, almost of any type. Now, we talked about the League of Nations after World War One. The League of Nations was more amorphous. It was more like, let's get together and we'll just make sure that this doesn't happen again. But there was no real kind of force behind it. There was and there is force with the UN, the United Nations, in terms of we have UN peacekeeping forces. So there's a military arm to the UN, and it's really designed to be almost an international governing body. And the Charter of the United Nations, the creation of the United Nations, the UN Charter was completed and signed in 1948. The head of it, the center of the United Nations, was in Washington D.C. No, excuse me, New York. But but the treaty establishing the UN was actually signed in San Francisco. Now, I would encourage all of you to read the UN Charter. I thought about signing it for this week, but I didn't. It's not. It's lengthy, but it's not overly lengthy. There's like 103 articles or something like that. But one of the things it establishes the General Assembly, which I kind of should have put up there, the General Assembly, because there's like 4 different instruments or institutions of the UN. The General Assembly, which is all the member states that vote. Then there is the Security Council. And up here I do have the Security Council. The permanent members of the Security Council are Britain, or the UK, the United Kingdom, which at this time was shrinking because of the whole decolonization process, which we'll talk about. Your textbook talks a lot more about it. So the UK, the US, the USSR, France, and China. I'll be talking about China shortly today, later today. But those are the permanent members. They're always a member of the Security Council, a representative from those 5 nations. And then in addition, according to the Charter, there are 10 additional members of the Security Council that are elected to 2-year terms. And theoretically, there shouldn't be any more than one member, a representative from one country. So they shouldn't have, 5 members from Italy, let's say, or Germany, or Uganda. It should be spread out so it's a real representative body with the 5 permanent members. And we still hear about the Security Council and vote to the Security Council. The effectiveness of the UN is another aspect, but the structure as it's being set up was designed as a means to ensure cooperation, give an instrument and an institution where international conflicts could be resolved in some ways democratically and peacefully. All the member countries of the UN, by signing the Charter, agreed to recognize and abide by its decisions. The Security Council was, let's say, the peacekeeping instrument to provide world security. There's also an economic and social council to look at human rights, for example, the UN Council on Human Rights. And then there was the Secretariat. So those are the 4 things: the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, and then the Secretariat, which is like the Secretary of the UN is like the President of the UN. And then also set up, and so here's actually a 4th institution of the UN, the International Court of Justice. It was designed that we need to have an international law court. Now, there is today an international criminal court. That was only established in the 21st century, like 2003 or something like that. So that is not the same as the International Court of Justice, which is in The Hague in the Netherlands. I lived very close to the Peace Palace, as it's called, or the Freedom Palace, or the Peace Palace, which is where the International Court of Justice sits for a number of years. And so it's established there, and that is where it's not the same court that tried the Nazi war criminals. That was a special tribunal. Okay, so that was not the International Court of Justice was not set up for that. They had a special international tribunal. Now, that's just putting that in perspective. But we hear about the International Court of Justice. We'll later in later lectures talk about the European Court of Justice, which is distinct from the International Court of Justice, and we'll hear about the European Court of Civil Rights and Human Rights. That's also a different institution. It can become very complex when we're talking about trying to establish, number one, international institutions, and then European institutions. And I'll be talking about that later as well, especially after the midterm when we talk about the European Union, which will be coming back to some of these developments. Okay. Now, the International Court of Justice, and this is something that I'll come back to at the very end of today's lecture with the question in terms of it being an international court with force. If countries don't abide by it, what good is it? Right now, Vladimir Putin stands condemned as a war criminal by the International Court of Justice. He has to be careful. I believe, I could be wrong, I'm going to have to check on this, but I believe Dick Cheney, Liz Cheney's father, is also convicted as a war criminal by the International Court of Justice. The problem is, how do you enforce that? Dick Cheney probably could travel to some countries without being arrested. Putin could travel to some countries without being arrested. And then the question would be, if Putin tried to travel to a country, what country is going to have the kind of the guts to arrest him or try to arrest him? That was the issue. Now, the United States was all for the UN, and it was the major force behind the development of the UN. It sits in, again, New York, the UN building there. New York is where it sits. So the joint session of the General Assembly meets in New York. It is a major institution that the U.S. also calls upon. We call upon, decisions of the Security Council to assure peace, as do the other members of the Security Council and the General Assembly. But the U.S., as other countries too, have frequently not gone along with decisions that go against them. They say, oh, but that doesn't have jurisdiction over us. We're not going to follow what the Security Council resolutions say. We're not going to follow what the General Assembly says. We're not going to follow the decisions of the legal decisions of the International Court of Justice, because we're kind of outside of that, even though we try to use those against those people we feel that are not in our best interest. So our enemies, so to speak, that are subject to the International Court of Justice will try to enforce that, but not when it comes to us. And indeed, officially, even in 1986, the U.S. withdrew from the compulsory jurisdiction of the court, because this was an issue with over Noriega, and the problems that were going on there that we're going to be talking about later. And they were condemned by the court, and the U.S. said, we're no longer going to recognize the authority of the International Court of Justice over us, even though we're still involved in the UN, and we'll still assert its legitimacy over others when we see fit. So it's kind of like a hypocritical stance there. That's the whole problem with law. Either there has to be a very clear and effective means of enforcing a law by coercive power and force, or there has to be sufficient pressure put on those subject to the law by the others, kind of social pressure. The conformity is increased, if not at least, helped out. Because if someone says, I'm not going to follow that law, so what? What happens? It's not like all of a sudden you disappear. How many of you jaywalk across University Boulevard? I do. And I've heard, I haven't seen it, but I've heard that people have been given tickets for doing that. Not using the crosswalks, or not using the crosswalks when the green light says walk, crossing somewhere else, going between the campus center and Kavanaugh, or whatever have you. I don't even think about it too much. I look both ways, and there's issues there. Obviously, a safety issue. There's some serious safety issues on University Boulevard, as I'm sure all of you know. But there's a law against jaywalking. But so many people do it. To really enforce that, they would have to have police officers there constantly issuing tickets to anyone who broke the law. The police don't do that. The campus police don't do that. So therefore, it's not really enforced. It's kind of saying this is something that everyone should comply with for safety reasons. People don't, and so what is the big deal about the law? It's not as if we're breaking the law and oops, ding, we get a ticket coming out of from midair or something like that. The same thing with international law. It's only as good as the people who are members and recognize the legitimacy of it, participate in it also for themselves and try to enforce it overall. So that becomes the real problem, is enforcement with the UN in general. So people say the UN is weak. Well, it's not necessarily weak. It's not nearly as weak as the League of Nations. But it doesn't necessarily have the force because it is dependent upon the cooperation of its members. And when its members allow some members to opt out, so to speak, without penalty, or don't really enforce the decisions of the UN, there are major issues, and we'll see that shortly. Because one of those major issues that the UN established was the creation of the State of Israel. Let's see, I think I actually kind of screwed up my PowerPoint slides, but that's okay. One got out of order, but I'll come back to it, namely the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but I'll come back to that. And I'm just looking here where it actually is. It's not where I had originally intended it to be, but I can fit it in there too. So my apologies for that. So that was going to be next because that came in 1948, but I'll get to that with the slide. The rearranged slide, unknowingly rearranged slide, pops back up. So now we'll get to the next slide in order as they are posted here, which is the creation of Israel and the problem of the Middle East, because that was based on a UN decision, UN Resolution 181, which came into effect in 1948. No, 1947. Excuse me, 1947. It's right there, on November 29th, 1947. Now, you will read that. It's a signed reading, and we'll see how that all comes about. Now, in the lecture leading up to World War II, so not the last lecture, but the one before that, I talked about the problem of the Middle East. I talked about the development of the issue of the rise of Zionism in terms of the nationalism, the conflicts, what do we do with the geographical region of Palestine, that had always been a region, not a state. After the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, what do we do with it? There's other Arab states that are kind of created out of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. But Palestine was not created as a state. It remained under the British mandate. And that's why we have the British White Paper of 1939 that you have read. What do we do with the territory? We have Arabs living within the region of Palestine, and we have Jews living within the region of Palestine. With the rise of Zionism, more Jews are immigrating to Palestine. I believe I also talked about the religious claims of both sides and how religious claims cannot be taken as historical claims, because if we rely on those religious claims, they'll never be solved. If we say the Jews are right because they claim that Yahweh gave Palestine as the promised land to the Jews, and then the Arabs or the Muslims come along, and the Muslim Arabs come along and say, no, we're right because Muhammad had shown us that Gabriel told him that we have the promised land was given to us by Allah, and the whole development from Abraham. It's Hagar was Abraham's first legitimate wife, and his eldest born was Ishmael, and that was the origins of the Arabs and therefore of the Muslims. Was the Jews are saying no, it's Hagar was not Sarah was Abraham's first actually legitimate wife, and Isaac was his legitimate heir. We have no way of proving either of those stories whatsoever. Those are religious beliefs. And the historian, as I've said before, can analyze and must analyze the impact of those religious beliefs, but we can't say that one is right. We can't say, okay, God, which one was it? Okay, I call Yahweh to the witness stand. Well, I call Allah to the witness stand. Well, actually, those are just two names of the same concept, names and terms that signify the same term as God, that which God signifies. So there'd be a real problem. We can't do that. Unless the Ten Commandments can be found that says, oh, here's evidence that God actually gave something to the ancient Israelites. And if we could verify that these tablets were divine origin that were given, that might change things a bit. But aside from that, there's no historical basis for either of the religious claims of the Arabs or the Jews, or the Muslims or the Jews. Just like I've talked about before, at least in 113, there is no historical evidence to support the position of Jesus of Nazareth having risen from the dead and having been the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity. There's some historical evidence that Jesus of Nazareth was a real person. So I'm not excluding Christianity from these three great religions of the book. But the problem is when their religious beliefs are asserted as the basis for political action. That's when we run into problems, and always have. And that was what was going on in the Middle East leading up to the outbreak of the First World War. And the Holocaust just made that problem infinitely more complex. And now what do we do? This was genocide, attempted genocide. And I've talked about the Holocaust and the 6 million Jews and the other peoples that were also victims of the Holocaust. But the Jews have been suffering all this, and it was an ongoing problem. What do we do? And the United Nations got together and said, okay, what we will do, we will take this region of Palestine and we'll create two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. And that was what was done in Resolution 181. The creation of two states. Now, you may have heard today with what's going on in the context of the Middle East of a two-state solution. Supposedly neither Israel today or the Palestinians want to have a two-state solution. That was what the UN imposed. That's what said. This is what we'll do. And I have up here a map of the division of Palestine in 1947. You see up there, your petition plan, the UN petition plan, with the yellow, kind of yellowish areas designed to be the Arab state and the orangish areas to be the Jewish state. How and why they divided it up like that, to me, is almost inconceivable. It was based on population centers. Jerusalem there is in white because that was still going to be overseen by the UN. Because both Muslims and Jews and Christians see Jerusalem as a holy city. So the issue is, how do we recognize the validity of religious beliefs and the competing religious beliefs of the people living in the territory with the political administration and statehood? Because as I argued in the lecture on the problems in the Middle East leading up to World War II, there had never been a state of Palestine. There was always a region. There had never been, historically seen, a state of Israel until 1947. 1947, the state of Israel was created and the state of the Arab state was created. And it was so after the horrors of the Holocaust, as a way of saying this is the only way we can provide the Jewish peoples with some ability to defend themselves. Problem is, we have two different populations living in the same territory. The UN, in its attempt to deal with the situation, carved it up as they did. Now, there's a map in your book um, because that shows it like in 1949 after the war, which I'll get there. Because the let's say newly established Arab countries, states, in the aftermath of World War One, and I talked about some of those in terms of the mandated territories of Palestine still stayed under the mandate until 1947. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, uh, Lebanon. I've already gone over those. They knew of the problem, obviously. They knew about the Holocaust, and they feared the creation, that the Holocaust and that the UN was going to bring about a Jewish state of Israel. And they formed their own Arab League in 1945. And the Charter of the Arab League in 1945 makes assertions that are not defensible by the evidence. Because what they did is the Arab Charter, that goes through all the, but it's only in an annex. It is an annex or an appendix. They argue that Palestine was a country as the others had been, kind of taken over and ruled by the Ottoman Empire, but was almost a pre-existing state. And they appeal to the Covenant of the League of Nations in 1919. They appealed to the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 to claim that those two documents recognize the right of the Palestinians to have a state in Palestine, in the territory. Yet those two documents, neither the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 nor the Covenant of the League of Nations in 1920, even mention it. I'm just going to read some of this from the Charter of the Arab League. Since the termination of the last Great War, the rule of the Ottoman Empire over the Arab countries, among them Palestine, which had become detached from that empire, has come to an end. She has come to be autonomous, not subordinate to any other state. The Treaty of Lausanne proclaimed that her future was to be settled by the parties concerned. No, it did not. However, even though she was as yet unable to control her own affairs, the Covenant of the League of Nations of 1919 made provisions for a regime based upon recognition of her independence. No, it did not. What they're doing is making general statements of states, pre-existing states, and applying that to Palestine. Her international existence, continuing on with the reading from the Charter, and independence in a legal sense cannot therefore be questioned any more than could the independence of other Arab countries. Yes, it could. Although the outward manifestations of this independence have remained obscured for reasons beyond her control, this should not be allowed to interfere with her participation in the work of the League, Council of the League. And so it goes on to argue for the Arabs in Palestine. It still is basically claiming that in Palestine is a territory where there are Arabs, and the Arabs are deserving of a state, and that has been already seen, that Palestine should become an Arab state. And we'll see after the midterm, when we return to the problems in the Middle East, the explicit identification of Palestine as a state and as an Islamic state is expressed for the first time in 1968, but we'll get there. But here, it's still kind of ambiguous. It's like the region has been promised to the Palestinians or to the Arabs living in Palestine. We're not talking about the Palestinian state yet. Now, the Arab League made their statement. UN comes in 1947, November 29th, and creates these two states, the map I just showed you. And what happens? And almost immediately, the Arab League declares war on Israel, the creation of the State of Israel in 1949-8, and invades. Israel, supported by the United States, fights back. A part of the problem here, too, was because immediately after, almost immediately after the UN Resolution 181 was passed in 1947, the United States officially recognized the state of Israel as an official state. Did not immediately recognize the Arab state as the state of Palestine or anything else. Because again, keep in mind, Palestine was a territory; it was not seen as a state. So even the name of the Arab state was not really clear. That too then was, let's say, because Britain did the same thing. Britain and the U.S. Recognized Israel as a state directly after the Resolution 181. So when the Arab League declares war, it's partly because of that lack of legitimization for the Arab state recognition, partly just in opposition completely, claiming that based on their interpretation of the British White Paper, which you've already read, they claim that the British White Paper promises Palestine to the Palestinian Arabs who are living within Palestine, granting rights to the Jewish residents for a homeland, not a state, but a homeland. In the Arab interpretation, that was not definitely a state. It was like, we will recognize their right to be here. We will recognize their religious traditions. We'll somehow work out a compromise in terms of the shared holy places and things. But they felt what was going on was increased immigration to Palestine and a lack of that recognition. And so they were also protesting their interpretation of the British White Paper with, let's say, the Western interpretation of the White Paper when they then invaded. And in 1949, Israel had conquered with the support of the U.S. and Britain. And there's a map in your book that's very good that gives the map of Israel. And after that war, the first kind of Arab war in 1949. And yet the conflict between the Arabs in Palestine and the newly created state of Israel just continued and continued and continued. And I'm not sitting here saying to you or anybody else that, and this side was right and this side was wrong and this should not have happened and that should not have happened. I'm not saying that. That is a political question. I'm just looking at the historical evidence, whereby we can't make claims that are not based on historical evidence, even though, of course, we do constantly in the geopolitical world. We need to be based on the evidence. That's what's going on. Anyway, so there has been continued conflict in the region of Palestine after the creation of the State of Israel, ever since 1947, and even going back further beyond that to the later 19th century. But the Holocaust made it urgent to do something, at least in the Western mind. Now, talk about the post-war mess. The Middle East was one of the post-war messes that was created trying to come to some resolution of the problems involved. It was not successful there. Now, another part of the U.S. or the mess, post-war mess, was reconstruction. Because what do we do with Europe now that basically we've bombed each other to shit? Excuse my French. How do we help restore and rebuild? And two major programs were suggested or instituted. The first was the Fulbright program in 1946. And the Fulbright program was by Senator Fulbright. That's why it was called the Fulbright program, because he said, you know what we should do? The problem is we don't know each other. If we can get young Americans to sit down and drink beer with young Germans, we'll have world peace. You see, how naive was that? Yeah, it's pretty naive. Yet, the exchange, international exchange, was a major issue. And the Fulbright program still exists. I was beneficiary of it. I received a Fulbright Fellowship. It is now also international. It's not just Americans and Germans. It's and Germans to Americans. It is worldwide. And you can apply for a Fulbright Fellowship. It's for recent undergraduates or graduating undergraduates as well as graduate students. And I got my Fulbright as a graduate student. It's also for teacher exchanges. And they have a lot of different programs in the Fulbright programs. And the whole point is to bring people together, people from different political backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, get them together to talk to each other and get to know each other to avoid future conflict. That too has not been all that successful in terms of avoiding future conflict. But it's been a very successful program. I think every Fulbright grantee would say that it's a fantastic program. You gain a lot of understanding, and you do. Does it avoid conflict? Not necessarily. But the idea was there. The far more impactful in terms of that was the Marshall Plan, the U.S. plan to restore and rebuild Europe. Have it there, $13.3 billion in 1948 dollars, $170.24 billion in today's dollars, approximately. That's a lot of money to rebuild, to restore, to repair after the horrors of the war. It led to prosperity, at least in Western Europe. It was not part of the Soviets. It was not part of the Eastern influence. Talked about the partition, the spheres of influence, partition of Germany into East and West Germany. It was for Western Europe. West Germany, France, Britain, Italy. Let's restore these. East was different. I'll talk more about that division again after the midterm. All kinds of fun things and further developments of where we go from there. That also made Europe feel dependent upon or indebted to the United States. Not only had the United States come in and helped win the war, we also then win the rebuilding. And the United States feeling that then, yes, Europe is indebted to us. We are close allies and partners. But what do we do about it? How do we keep that relationship strong so it won't be kind of a clientele relationship of European countries being clients of the United States? We'll talk more about this too after the midterm. Again, the post-war mess just continues, and I have to make kind of a break. It's kind of difficult in terms of where to have the midterm and what to include and what not, because we'll be talking about the Cold War here, and yet aspects of the Cold War I'll be talking about again after the midterm when we will go back. For example, the establishment of NATO, I'll talk about after the midterm. But here we see the importance of trying to figure out what do we do in the aftermath of the Second World War. And the Marshall Plan was a way of building up it all to restore what had come about. And here I come back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Because the idea was, if we can rebuild Europe, great. If we can create a state to help prevent genocide against the Jews, to help prevent against anti-Semitism on that wide scale, maybe we can establish peace. If we have the UN as the international institution to guard that, we also need to have principles and ideals to make sure that world peace can be upheld. And what is the basis of that? Human rights. Now, this is the other document that is assigned for you for this week. It is very much part of your midterm and will be part of your final. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the UN on December 10th, 1948. I'm not going to go into the details. I want you to read it. Think about it. Ponder it. There had not been such a document previously. Oh, we have the U.S. Declaration of Independence. We have Olympe de Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen, and we have the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This is a universal declaration of human rights that was to be the principles guiding all member states of the UN, all signatories to the Universal Declaration. It was not, as such, an instrument of international law. It was the basis for international law, at least international human rights law. I think it's an amazing document. It brings up the problem, though, of the distinction between the ideas, the ideal, and the reality. How was it designed to function? It was designed to function as this is how we are going to live and work and operate. And if we follow this Universal Declaration of Human Rights in conjunction with the UN, we can avoid future military conflict. Again, how does it function? Well, some people follow it, some people don't. Some people claim to follow it, but yet don't at all. And when you go through those rights, those proclamations of fundamental human rights for every human being as a human being, and then look at the realities in the world today. It's okay. Is this a goal, an ideal, a principle? Is the idea of, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness a statement of what should be done, what must be done and enforced, or is it a goal and a hope of what we're striving to achieve? How do we handle the discrepancy between the precept and the practice, the ideal and the reality? And that's a problem. Again, I'll be talking more about this, getting ready for the midterm and getting ready for the final. So these two documents this week of reading, the UN Resolution 181, just for understanding what's going on in the world today, and then the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also important for understanding what's going on in the world today. They're also important for your midterm and your final. I shouldn't say obviously for your midterm, but and your final. So that's what that was going. So that was the approach to try to solve the problem. And yet, did it? No. Because even as World War II came to an end, even as the Allies were victorious, there were tensions within, as I already pointed to, namely the Soviets, Stalin. There are allies, as I said before. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. There still are my enemy when that common enemy is taken care of. Those tensions break apart and in the whole dividing up of the world after World War II, the creation of these superpowers, as I talked about in the previous lecture, USSR and the US, how do we deal with this? And we have something called the Truman Doctrine. Harry Truman, 1947. Truman gives a speech, which is the speech, a very famous speech, which he articulates not only the U.S. policy, but almost the policy for the West to contain the spread of communism. It's an issue of containment. We must contain the threat of communism because these two societies, the Western free capitalistic democratic world and the Eastern communistic Soviet influenced world, were at odds. Some ways, similarly to the Jews and the Arabs in Palestine, and the Jews and the Muslims in general, appealing to their religious origins. The ideologies were so important of the West and of the East. The Soviet influence, the U.S. influence. How do we go it? Because it can't just be words and ideals when conflict breaks out. And the first major conflict broke out between the two superpowers over Korea and the Korean War, which there you can see was from 1950 to 1953. Now, the Korean War was not officially declared a war. It never also ended in a peace treaty. It's still technically ongoing, so to speak. There was an armistice that was signed. The sides could not agree to a peace treaty. But let's look at what was going on with the Korean War. Why did it break out, and why Korea, of all places? I have up here the slide. This is a slide underneath the Truman Doctrine, the beginnings of the Cold War. Here's the Korean War. I have up here Korea and Korean War more specifically. The first little bullet point there is Japan annexed Korea in 1910. We have to realize that in World War II, we have not only Europe, we also have Japan, the Japanese empire that was going on, the Pacific, the theater as well. And here, this next map shows the expansion of the Japanese empire and what they had taken over. And I said already in 1910, Japan had annexed Korea. If you see there, there's the map of Japan and Korea. There's, you can see China and the Soviet Union and Mongolia. You can see then Burma under the UK, Thailand, French Indochina, which would become very important because that became Vietnam, but I'll talk about that after the midterm. The Philippines with the U.S. colonies, Malaya, UK colonies, the Dutch East Indies, and then Australia. So that's kind of the geographical sphere. And Japan keeps growing and expanding. And after World War II, it's like, what do we do about it? This next map, then, it was the solution after World War II of dividing up Korea. And they divided it up as they were dividing up everywhere else in Europe too, basically between two spheres of influence, or here even two territories of occupation. North Korea and South Korea. North Korea would be the area occupied by the Soviets. South Korea would be the area occupied by the U.S. And the division was the 38th parallel. You may have heard that if you ever watched MASH. I don't know, maybe, I grew up with MASH. MASH, I think, was one of the all-time greatest TV series ever. It's about the Korean War. The 38th parallel, splitting the country in half, which you can see. And if you kind of look back to that broader map, that first map of Japanese expansion, you can see the relationship between China, Japan, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean, basically, and is right there. So you can understand why the Soviet influence would kind of be coming from the north to be the occupied territory of North Korea, and the U.S. actually kind of with its ally China, which I'll get back to in a second, and then having taken over Japan, was going to be occupying the South. Now, in 1948 already, the North Korea and South Korea became not just occupied territories, but two independent sovereign states. But the problem there, if you look back at the map, you can see the relationship to China. The problem was China. Because even before World War II broke out, China was at war with Japan. We talk about the China-Japan War, the Sino-Japanese War. I have up there the problem with China, the Chinese Civil War, which I'll get to, but that is in the context of the China-Japan War, Japanese War, because they are fearing the expansion of the Japanese Empire. And you can see on the map why that would be the case. And the government of China was known as the Republic of China. The Republic of China was being supported by Russia against Japan, at least at first. China was supporting the Allies, Russia, France, the U.S., Britain. And the Soviets changed sides. Why did they do that? Because within the conflict of this China-Japanese War, a major faction had been growing within China, namely the Chinese Communist Party. And the Soviets started to support the Chinese Communist Party, not China as such. The government, the people of the Republic of China was the official government. But with the help of the Russian support and the U.S. support and British support, the Republic of China was able to defeat finally Japan after Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Nagasaki, because Japan had declared war on the U.S. because they were supporting China against their war. Whereas Russia then started supporting the Communist Party in China that became increasingly important and increasingly grew in numbers in opposition to Japan. And after the ending of World War II, after the ending of the China-Japan War, China, the Republic of China, became one of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, as I already mentioned. You may say, well, yeah, why was China there? This is why China was there. But at the time, there's already a significant, almost counter government within the Republic of China that then in 1946 came into open warfare with Soviet support, proclaimed themselves as the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, as opposed to the ROC. They were the communists fighting with the Soviet influence and support. And there was the Chinese Civil War, 1946 to 1949, when, because of the Soviet influence and support of the communists, of the People's Republic of China, the Republic of China, which had been the official government of China that had been part of the United Nations and the Security Council, retreated to the island of Taiwan. Now, you may be aware that there's a problem with Taiwan today. Well, actually, Taiwan was simply the place where the official government, the Republic of China, that had been fighting with the Allies in World War II, had retreated from in light of the Soviet communist support of the People's Republic of China within the context of the Chinese Civil War. The UN recognized China as the People's Republic of China, the Republic of China. They did not recognize the People's Republic of China. Therefore, the Soviets boycotted the UN. They said, basically, screw you, Both the People's Republic of China, the Communist China, and then the Republic of China, that was now in Taiwan, advocated a one China policy. Now, you've heard that term too. Both said there's one China. What do we do with Taiwan now? Because Taiwan was just the name of an island, and then it was part of China, it was part of the Republic of China. Now it's all that was left of the Republic of China, and the People's Republic of China had the mainland in China and the Soviet support and were communists and had won their civil war. And they're very influential in supporting the Soviet influence in North Korea. If you look at the map, they're very close. So you have the Soviet influence in North Korea, the Chinese influence in North Korea. You have Taiwan sitting there not knowing really what to do. You have the U.S. supporting in South Korea, the UN supporting South Korea. How does it all work? 1953, Joseph Stalin dies. New Soviet government comes in and doesn't really support China, but still supporting North Korea. And with that support, North Korean forces invade the South. And that began what's known as the Korean War in 1950. That was part of it. Excuse me, I kind of messed it up. Northern troops invaded the South in 1950. Stalin dies in 1953. That allowed for the ending of the war, the peace treaty. So I'm sorry about that. I hope that's clear. So what happens in 1950, after the end of the Chinese Civil War, with Soviet support, with China, with Communist China support, North Korea invades South Korea. Goes meaning going further beyond the 38th parallel. The 38th parallel simply being the latitudinal designation. When Stalin dies, that kind of withers the support for the North, and so a ceasefire is arranged in 1953. Fighting had gone back and forth and back and forth. It was a very bloody, hard fought jungle warfare, and returned to the 38th parallel, and an armistice was finally signed, but no peace treaty was signed. That was also based on the Truman Doctrine. We can't allow this to happen. We have to come to the support of South Korea. We have to fight for South Korea. We've already basically lost China. We're not going to let this happen again. We've tried to take over and step in Greece to prevent further communist incursions in Greece. And we will see after the midterm, we do so again when the French say we no longer can deal with French Indochina. Go for it. If you want to take over, fine, which we did. And that led to the Vietnam issue. All part of this idea of we have to contain the spread of communism. China has now been lost except for Taiwan. So we have to support Taiwan. The Republic of China, which was the Chinese government in World War II and the United Nations, until the communists came in and fought them off. We have to support South Korea against North Korea because our whole way of life is being threatened by the threat of communism led by Russia, by the Soviet Union. And the two superpowers, the US and the USSR, are kind of struggling on the ideological level and on the political level in the global context. And that became known as the Cold War. But certainly it was not a Cold War in Korea. It was not a Cold War in Vietnam. What I meant by a Cold War is that the USSR and the USA did not actively declare war on each other and have military conflict, but we came very, very close to armed conflict and to nuclear conflict, which too we'll get to after the midterm. World War II, supposedly the war to end all wars. I don't know. But part of this ideological conflict that led to the United States saying we are going to fight this also theologically, basically, because one of the threats of communism, they're atheistic, basically. Marx referred to religion as the opium of the people, opiate of the people. So we, in this ideological structure, are going to emphasize our Christian religious origins, or what were considered such. And in 1954, the Congress passed the resolution to add one nation under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. The original Pledge of Allegiance was actually composed in 1885 by a Baptist socialist pastor. It was rather simple, also for children, more or less. It was kind of revised a little bit later in 1982 to have it more general. It was used with the foundation and establishment of Columbus Day to be said by school children everywhere. And it became almost required to say the Pledge of Allegiance, not only in school, but then in government meetings and so. And I'm assuming you all know it. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, with liberty and justice for all. Amen. Not amen, but with liberty and justice for all. That was the original. And in 1954, they said, we are going to add a line. One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That under God was added in 1954 to fight off and to reassure us that we are on God's side against the godless communists. Now, the pledge, too, even though I said it was written by a Baptist socialist, still originally, you know how it was said? It was said like this. If you go back, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And then what happens with the rise of the Nazis and Hitler? This became the Nazi salute. It's like, oh my God, we can't have that. So it was officially changed in 1942 to say, okay, we're not going to do this salute. We're going to say it with our hand over our heart. So from that point on, we say the Pledge of Allegiance with our hand over heart. And then in 1954, we include one nation under God. Now, why was it said like this? That's the imperial salute, the Roman imperial salute. Hail Caesar. Hail Caesar. That's the imperial salute. Even though we have this, Baptist socialist pastor, there's still this idea of the U.S. being the real inheritors of the Roman Empire with the eagle, the symbolism. Symbols are important. And this imperial salute, why does Hitler and the Nazis use the imperial salute? Because they were the Third Reich, the third German Empire, after the second of Bismarck, after the first of Barbarossa, which was the continuation of the Roman Empire itself. This imperial ideology was there. And the U.S. bought into it until it's like, uh-oh, here's the evil empire. We can't do that, so we're going to put it over our hearts. And then we have one nation under God added to the Pledge of Allegiance officially on June 14th, 1954. 2 years later, the Congress declared that the phrase, "In God we trust," would appear on U.S. currency. Previously did not. And then in 1956, Congress declared it as the official motto of the United States rather than a pluribus unum. Now, if you look at your money, a pluribus unum is always still there. From many, one. That was the motto of the United States until 1956. From many, one. A pluribus, out of many, one. To, not that, but in God we trust. Again, to fight against the communists, the godless communists. We'll talk about the 50s, McCarthyism, Cold War, more after the midterm, but this is what was going on in this post-war mess. So this post-war mess just continues in some ways. I'll be coming back to themes that I've addressed here before the midterm, after the midterm, as we lead on to the final, because I hope you know the final is comprehensive. So it's even a messy break for the midterm, so to speak. It's a messy break in terms of dealing with the topics that were going on and the developments that were going on, because all of the developments of the post-war period shape and inform the world in which we live today. And we won't understand what's going on in our world today if we don't understand what was going on in the post-war period, this horribly messy period, which just in some ways kept getting worse and worse and messier and messier and messier. That's what we're looking at. Ideals and reality, precept and practice, the problem with law. These are all things I've pointed to. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I hope you will read. I encourage you to read even almost independently of this class. I think it's an important document for everybody to read and to think about and ponder. What does it mean? How do we handle this ideal and then the actual reality? How do we handle the ideal of world government for peace and harmony and getting along with the conflicts that go on all the time? How do we handle the divisiveness within the context of an ideal we're all one? Especially when then that phrase, "in God we trust," starts taking on individual interpretations and applying it to the whole. It has nothing to do with the founding fathers. I've said that before. Were we a Christian nation at the founding? Absolutely not. A deistic, maybe, but not a Christian nation. A lot of Christians there. But this one nation under God, in God we trust, that was a development of the Cold War, an attempt to counter and oppose the godless communists. Ideas and reality, what difference do they make? How do we understand them? Will law settle the problem? Not at all. What's the basis of the law? As I already said, in terms of the United Nations, it's only as good as the enforcement and the buying into the validity of the law. The Great War was not the war to end all wars. World War II was not the war to end all wars, despite the efforts of the world to make it such with the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But war, conflict, military, conflict, death, horror just continued. Almost goes back to the very origins of civilization with this us versus them. That was the very origins of civilization and cities. Us versus them. And as for civilization, was it civilization from? Cities, life in the cities. What makes a city? A wall. A wall demarcates us versus them. The foreigners, the aliens. Who are we? Who are they? They are our enemies. They want what we have. We have to protect what we have. That mentality is 6,000 years old and still develops. It's probably even older, going even before civilization to human cultures and developments. And we're still fighting with it. We're still doing that. And we'll talk about, again, after the midterm, about the breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, so to speak, and how Putin is trying to reestablish not just the Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire. But we'll talk about that after the midterm. But it's this us versus them. On what is it based? And why can't we all just be human and recognize each other's humanity? And the bane of civilization is that us versus them. We have, you don't have. Ha ha. Well, we are going to take what you have. No, you're not. Yes, you are. That still continues. Not necessarily a success story, this thing called civilization, even in its modern form. That's it for now. Talk about the midterm next talk lecture. There won't be, again, there will not be a PowerPoint for that talk. Lecture 2 will be just listed as lecture 2. Or maybe I'll just lecture as preparing for the midterm or review session or something. But I think it will be very important and helpful. I think the first one, I hope the first one was for those of you who followed it along. So I'll be going through both parts of the exam, giving indications of what is expected, how to go about answering it, what I look for and hope for, because I hope everybody will do a better job on this midterm than they did on the first midterm. But I'll be talking more about that next lecture, talk, video, whatever. Thanks so much. Bye bye.